So bear with me. One moment, please. Okay. Great. Can everyone see the welcome screen in front of you? Okay. If you cannot, you can unmute yourself and let me know, but I'm guessing since no one's unmuting themselves, you can see it. So I wanted to welcome you all. So as I said a moment ago, my name is Hannah Schaefer-Tibbett, and I am the program director for Cold Harbor Institute. For those that have never been to Cold Harbor or maybe even heard of Cold Harbor, we are a nonprofit organization based out of Western Colorado University in Gunnison, Colorado. We manage a ranch about 7 miles east of town. And then we also have some incredible graduate students leading some projects in various areas as well. So if you haven't heard about us before, I'll put our website link in the chat. Before we get started with the webinar, before we hear the more exciting person talk, there are just a few kind of logistical things that I wanted to remind you of. One is to please make sure your mic is on mute. If it's not and Michelle is speaking and it's not question and answer time, I'll just put you on mute. Don't take it personally. Speaking of which, I will also lead, or Michelle rather, will lead a question and answer section at the end for about 10 minutes. And if you don't feel like speaking during the Zoom session, feel free to type your chat in the question box and I'll monitor that. Another important logistical thing, like I said earlier, is that we will be recording this session. So if you don't want your face seen, or rather your voice heard, you can type your questions in the chat box. One of the last details before I change the next slide is that we are a nonprofit organization. These webinars are free to attend. So at the end, I will provide you with a link to where if you feel so obligated to, or if you want to, you are more than welcome to donate to Cold Harbor. And if you feel like you've gotten something out of this event, which I'm sure you will, I'll provide the donation link at the end of the webinar. Lots of links coming your way, but I'll make sure you know what they're for. So today, I'm super duper stoked to introduce our speaker. Her name is Michelle Niehaus. She'll be speaking on the history of conservation in the Gunnison Valley and beyond. And she's an author, she's an editor for The Atlantic. She's also an editor for High Country News, which is actually right across, their office is right across from ours at Western. Before I let Michelle introduce herself, I also want to talk about briefly our webinar next month. So we will be having Roberto Guerra. He is also a part of High Country News. He's a photo editor, and he'll be speaking on storytelling through photography. And his webinar will be April 4th, 2022. So be sure to look out for the link to attend that event. And Michelle, that's really it from me. Like I said, folks, if you need anything, you can't hear well, you can't see something, let me know in the chat and I can try and fix it. All right, that's it on my end. Michelle, why don't you take it over?
Hey everyone, it's good to be here tonight. I was telling Hannah that I lived in Western Colorado in Paonia, right over Kepler Pass for 15 years, and I moved to the Northwest in 2013, but I haven't been back to Paonia since before the pandemic. So it's really nice to visit the valley, if only visit the Gunnison Valley and be close to my old home, if only virtually. So let me share my screen. And can you all see that? Hopefully.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So I want to talk tonight about the history of conservation in the Gunnison Valley and beyond, mostly beyond, but we'll have a little contextualization of some of these big trends by bringing them to the local level and seeing what was happening at the time locally. I came to the history of conservation not as a historian, but as a biologist in training. When I graduated from college, I had a degree in biology. I spent a couple of years supporting myself with seasonal jobs as an assistant on wildlife research projects, mostly in the desert Southwest. This is me outside Tucson, Arizona. And these were really cool jobs. They brought me to incredible landscapes and I worked with great people, but they also brought me up close and fascinatingly, but disturbingly, into contact with a lot of the bitter and sometimes even violent controversies around vulnerable species that were happening at the time. This was in the mid 1990s. And as many of you know, those continue today. And what was really interesting to me about them was that people were talking about these profound questions. They were going to local meetings and their town halls, and they were talking about, like, why are we responsible for this species? Why this species and not another one? And they were all, I mean, these were very legitimate questions, of course, but they weren't going to be resolved in the course of a single meeting, much less in, or in the course of a series of meetings. And I kept, as someone interested in conservation, I thought, well, I know that people in the past have wrestled with these questions and come up with some provisional answers. But I think also, like most people in conservation, I didn't have a sense of the conservation movement as a movement, like as a tradition that had developed over time. So after I became a journalist and started to write about very similar controversies, and after I kept seeing the same dynamic happening over and over again, people, wrestling with these very basic questions and never really getting to, okay, how should we protect this species? What should we do as a community to protect this species? I started to think it might be helpful to try to put the story of conservation together in a single narrative. There are a lot of biographies out there of famous conservationists that put their life stories in the context of the conservation movement at the time, but no one, to my knowledge, had really tried to put it together in an accessible format, something that would be useful to professionals, but also interesting and accessible to people who are just interested in the future of other species, which hopefully is all of us. So that became my book, Beloved Beasts, which came out last spring, and it's coming out in paperback in a few days, actually. And the first of many challenges with this book, I soon figured out that one of the reasons why no one had written a book like this before is that it was very difficult to do. So one of many challenges that I had that turned out to be satisfying, but were intimidating at the time, was to figure out exactly when the conservation movement started. So I wanted to obviously distinguish the conservation movement from the kind of conservation that people have practiced on a local level for millennia. Indigenous groups and other rural communities have been practicing different kinds of conservation, often very successfully, for a very long time. The conservation movement, what I think of as the conservation movement, started in North America and Europe in the mid 1800s. And it started with the public understanding that humans could drive other species extinct on a global level, and not just directly through overhunting, but through consumer decisions. So the things that people were buying in their industrializing societies were having an effect on species, perhaps that they would never encounter in real life. So that's what really started what I think of as the modern conservation movement. And one of the really memorable signs that this realization was taking hold in society in wealthy societies in the mid 1800s was the appearance of a giant talking dodo in the pages of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in the 1860s. Charles Dodgson, let's see, could we mute that? Thank you. Charles Dodgson, writing as Lewis Carroll, wrote himself into the story as a giant talking dodo. And I think that really symbolized the dodo had been extinct for a couple hundred years at that point, but people had not quite, they knew this bird had existed, in a faraway island, but they had not really put it together that their support of international trade and their country's exploration of other places and exploitation of other places had led to the disappearance of the dodo on a small island in the Indian Ocean. So once that realization took hold, belatedly took hold, then people realized, oh, it's not just these birds on distant islands, it's actually, we can drive physically large, famously abundant species extinct, most notably the Plains bison. And many of you know the story. Throughout the 19th century, the bison, which, there are all these accounts of how bison, quote unquote, darken the landscape when people would come upon a herd. There were just millions of them throughout North America. But as commercial hunters started to feed demand in North America and Europe for buffalo hides, the population started to spiral down toward extinction. And once people in urban North America and Europe realized this was happening, absorbed the fact that, yes, this giant, physically giant species could be driven extinct by human activities, there was acceptance of that reality, but then there was kind of a resignation. Like there were editorials published at the time, oh, isn't this so sad, but perhaps it's the price of progress. And it really took that first generation of conservationists, members of the conservation movement, who were, for the most part, wealthy white sportsmen from cities. It took them to say, they were complex folks and didn't, their decisions were not, in many cases, were not the decisions we would have made today, but they did have this great foresight and ability to stand up and say, look, no, this is not inevitable. And it's wrong. And we have, as a society, we have a responsibility to prevent it because we're responsible for it. So that was the first generation of the conservation movement. So just to put this in some local context of the Gunnison Valley, as many of you know, the Utes were also very affected, like most tribes that had some territory on the plains, were very affected by the decline of the bison. It was devastating. Sportsmen, in fact, there have been studies showing that the economic effects are still reverberating today. And the sportsmen who protected the bison, ironically or sadly, did not really understand, and in some cases willfully ignore the effect of the bison decline on Indigenous peoples of North America. And in fact, even in some cases, even blamed North American tribes for the decline of the bison, even though there was lots of evidence at the time that white commercial hunters were primarily responsible for it. So by the 1880s, by the time that the bison were declining and then would be rescued from the brink of extinction in the beginning of the 1900s, the Ute territory had been reduced to western Colorado, including the Gunnison Valley, where they wintered. And then gold and silver and extensive coal beds were discovered in the Gunnison Valley. And once the U.S. government and once white settlers realized that the Gunnison Valley was a lot more valuable than they had previously realized, settlers started to encroach on Ute territory. And then in 1880, that Chief Urey signed the treaty, the second treaty with the US government that resulted in the further reduction of legally recognized Ute territory to the reservations that we know today in western Colorado and in eastern Utah. So as white settlement expanded throughout the West into native territory, many in the US government became very concerned about the effects of deforestation. And this is Teddy Roosevelt on the left and his friend Gifford Pinchot on the right. Teddy Roosevelt was a member of that first generation of conservationists who had really cared, despite blind spots in many other respects, had really cared about the future of the bison. And he was also concerned about the future of the forest, which by that time cattle ranchers in the Gunnison Valley and elsewhere were kind of using as their personal grazing reserves. And in 1891, right about the time that Chief Urey signed that treaty that so reduced Ute territory, Congress signed the Forest Reserves Act. And among the first forest reserves were the White River Forest Reserve and Battlement Mesa Forest Reserve. So This was not popular in the Gunnison Valley or in the North Fork Valley or pretty much anywhere else in the West. This was seen as, this is really the beginning of the long history of arguments between Western landowners and Western land users of many kinds and the federal government. There's some great stories about Teddy Roosevelt really joyfully setting out these giant forests, and then Western senators doing what he described as, handsprings of dismay when they found, when he had declared these forests. So it set up a dynamic that has led to a lot of I would say it's been a mixed blessing in the West, and I can talk a little bit about that later. So the Forest Reserve System became the Forest Service in 1905, and the Forest Service we know today. And Gifford Pinchot, who again was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt's, became its first chief. And what you might not know is that the very first forest ranger in the United States, Ranger Number 1, worked in the Gunnison Valley for most of his career. His name was Bill Kreutzer, sorry, and he is a really interesting character. There was a short biography written about him that written by someone who knew him during his lifetime, and the biography was written in the mid 20th century, and it's just full of, he was an interesting guy, and he was present at a lot of really formative events in the region. So it's worth reading. It's got tons of local color. So people were so angry about the Forest Reserve System and later the Forest Service that when Bill Kreutzer rode into Gunnison on his horse to start work, he started right when the Forest Service was formed in 1905, and he was surrounded by a crowd of angry ranchers on the main drag in Gunnison saying, what does this mean? The forest reserves are bad enough. What is this Forest Service? What are you talking about? Who are you anyway? And he was quite, from what I've read about him, he must have been quite a diplomat, because he managed to diffuse a lot of these situations. And he stuck, unlike many public lands managers today, he stuck around in the same area long enough to really get to know people. So he dealt with a lot of, as you probably heard about, the conflicts between cattle and sheep ranchers. Cattle ranchers did not like when sheep ranchers came into the forest because they thought they ruined the range. And Kreutzer was actually held at gunpoint by a group of cattle ranchers who were cattle ranchers who were upset about sheep being allowed to graze on the Slate River. He managed to talk his way out of that situation as well, and then actually managed to he actually made the cattle and sheep ranchers work together to survey the range, and apparently that strengthened their relationships enough that it slowly began to lead to a not exactly a friendly relationship, but a better working relationship between the cattle ranchers and the sheep ranchers. So that was the beginning of the public lands era in Western Colorado and the region. And as you know, today, Gunnison County, like many Western counties, is something like 80% plus public land. You've got not only the Forest Service, but you've got the Park Service, you've got the Bureau of Reclamation, you've got the Bureau of Land Management. Have I forgotten anyone? You've got some state lands in there. And so it's a huge part of how conservation is done in the West. And again, mixed blessing. I can talk about that a little bit later. So going back to the kind of larger trends in conservation, the way I structured my book was I followed the careers of about a dozen people who I saw as really pivotal in the conservation movement. So I started with, and these were people who either they brought about a big change or they were present at a significant change. And I started with William Hornaday, who was one of those sportsmen who helped save the American bison. He was the director of the Bronx Zoo, and he actually raised a herd of bison in the Bronx and put the bison on a train, shipped them out to Oklahoma. And we are still reintroducing those bison today. In fact, there's sort of the happy irony of Hornaday and his allies' racism is that there's now this really cool continent-wide effort that's led by Native American communities to do a much deeper ecosystem restoration of the bison, rather than just making sure the species survives. It's a real ecological and cultural restoration of the bison. So, it's Hornaday's views are limited. We're glad that he did the work that he did to make sure the species survives, and but it wasn't he didn't finish the job, and now we're able to finish the job. So I won't go through all these figures, but just to mention, the woman next to Hornaday on the right, just to the right of Hornaday, is Rosa Ledge, who really contributed to. She was active at a time in the 1920s and 30s when conservation was becoming a much more inclusive grassroots movement. A lot of bird lovers came into the movement, and she really made an argument that, like, look, you sportsmen, you can't keep, just protecting the species you like. You really have to protect species you don't like too, because that's what conservation is about. She was very far-seeing at a time when people really didn't have a concept of ecology, but she knew that was not ours that which species to save was not really ours to decide. And then there's Teddy Roosevelt again, this time not with Giver Pinchot, but with John Muir. So after walking through the lives, walking alongside the lives and careers, so to speak, of some of these famous and not so famous people, and trying to weave their stories together into a story about the bad and good of conservation and where it might be headed, I feel qualified to make a few generalizations. And I think that these in many ways will apply to the Gunnison Valley, as well as to the conservation movement in general. So accomplishments of the conservation movement over time. In the background, by the way, is a herd of bison on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. And those, like many of the bison in the West, are descendants of the Hornaday herd. And they're part of a herd that may, if all goes well, may begin to move freely between the Blackfeet Reservation and the adjoining Glacier National Park. So that would be a really cool step toward restoring some of the bison's original migration patterns. So the conservation movement prevented the extinction of many species that are loved and valued today. I think maybe that's obvious, but it's really worth remembering that there are a lot of species that we have today that we wouldn't have were it not for the action of other people or people from the past. There are, it's so easy to be thinking about the losses and the emergencies in front of us, but we really would not have the bison were it not for the conservationists that save the species. We would not have salmon. We would not have many songbirds. Because they were hunted. So many species were hunted nearly to extinction for millinery and bedding at the turn of the 19th century. So I think it's important to remember what has been accomplished. Sorry, let me get to lost my cursor here. Here we go. Raise and sustain public concern about other species. I mean, the fact that kids grow up now knowing about, what a species is, what an ecosystem is, even, sadly, what extinction is, the fact that all those words are part of our pretty much everyday vocabulary, I think is thanks to the conservation movement. There was a time when those were not even common currency in scientific circles, much less in public dialogue. So that's really important. Something we don't talk about is too much, but is really important, is that the conservation movement created institutions capable of working across political boundaries. And that's where I think actually federal agencies are really important, despite some of the problems that they have caused. The fact that we have a Forest Service that can think about the forest on something like a continental level is pretty important, because as we know, most species, humans are the only species that, volunteer to obey political boundaries. Everything else, unless you're physically stopping it, it's going to cross those boundaries. So I think it's important to have those national and international institutions. And I'm thinking here not just of internationally, not just of advocacy groups that work in many different countries, but things like the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which makes it possible for governments to work together across national boundaries to protect species that cross those boundaries, or range, whose range extends across those boundaries. I'm not saying those institutions are doing everything that they could do, far from it, but their existence is really important. And finally, they evolved from I think the conservation movement has evolved from an effort to prevent extinction to an effort to protect relationships. Like I said, when sportsmen saved the bison from extinction, they were sort of, they treated the bison like livestock. You know, they William Hornaday raised bison in the Bronx, stuck them out on the prairie, kind of like cows, and hoped that they survived and reproduced. And luckily they did, but he didn't have a sense of that we do today of how important the bison are to the prairie ecosystem. That came later. So conservation movement has actually done a really good job, I think, of absorbing the lessons of ecology and conservation biology and incorporating that into its work. So all those compliments given, here are what I see as the drawbacks. And this is Teddy Roosevelt, who I'm being a little hard on here by making fun of this picture. But I mean, here he is tricked out in his best buckskin, but this picture was taken in a New York studio. So it kind of, to me, it kind of encapsulates Roosevelt's, a lot of people in the early history of conservation and today too have done, as I wrote in my book, have done the right thing for the wrong reason. You know, their love, I'm not saying their love for the bison was not genuine. I think it was. I think they really admire this animal, but they also, it was all wrapped up with their love of the hunt and their feeling that the hunt was really important to protecting white masculinity and national pride. And that, I think, limited their perspective a little bit. And the way that we're still feeling that today, I think, is that it led them to dismiss the needs and abilities of subsistence hunters and farmers. They were sportsmen, but they looked down on people who hunted for a living or, you know, depended directly on other species for a living, and considered them part of the problem in many cases. And that led them to rely on top-down solutions, as we saw with Teddy Roosevelt in the Declaration of the Forest Service, and his kind of like, you know, thumbing his nose at all the Western senators and declaring these huge national forests. I mean, I'm the first to say I'm glad we have them, but it's very typical of that era of conservationists where there was not a lot of respect for conservation, local conservation expertise or traditions or knowledge, and a lot of faith in top-down solutions. And then finally reinforce the conceptual and literal separation of people and nature. And that, you know, they were really concerned about protecting other species from people, right? So they were, you know, a lot of early conservation was about drawing boundaries, about protecting, about establishing reserves, about establishing national forests, and not a lot of attention was paid to supporting people in living alongside other species, you know, living outside boundaries, but sustainably alongside other species. And that to me is the big missing piece in what I think of as the conservation ecosystem. There's not that kind of support for, you know, a society-wide coexistence with other species. That takes me to the guy who's really in some ways the heart of my book. It was Aldo Leopold. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work, author of a Sand County Almanac. I love this quote from him, even though it's unusually snarky for him. He was usually very polite, almost to a fault, but this is from a speech that was given during one of the first big storms of the Dust Bowl. You know, one of the first storms that was like, came out of the Dust Bowl, and people on the East Coast and in the upper Midwest were seeing their own skies darken with dust, and they were feeling the grit. And so that may have been why he was in such a mood when he gave this speech. But so he says, there is a people minority called conservationists who are indignant about something. They're just beginning to realize that their task involves the reorganization of society rather than the passage of some fish and game laws, and I would add, or, you know, the establishment of game reserves and parks. And so he was kind of, you know, that he wasn't alone at the time, but he was probably the most prominent voice and in the minority of the conservation movement, in his recognition that the conservation movement needed this grassroots level, that it could not exist solely with top-down strategies. Certainly they're important, but they're not enough on their own, because you can't have everything you want to protect locked up behind boundaries. You have to have support from society, from people who live on the landscape, which is all of us. And this led to, I mean, as many of you know, people were dispossessed when our national parks were established. And then when the conservation movement, the institutional conservation movement, went international and started working in colonized countries with colonial governments, these effects broadened, and in many cases were extremely tragic, continue to be so today. Actually, there are a lot of people being displaced and deprived of their livelihoods because of top-down conservation action. And I say that as a supporter of the conservation movement's work. There is still a long way to go. And especially in Africa, when parks and reserves were established by conservation governments, a lot of people were displaced, and a lot of people were deprived of livelihoods, and the established relationship that people had with other species, their existing conservation practices were disrupted. And so this wasn't good for people, obviously, and it wasn't good for other species, because all of a sudden these parks were surrounded by hostile neighbors. There's no longer any reason to practice their conservation traditions if these species were just going to be conserved for wealthy foreigners. And so I think those, and I'll move quickly through the rest of this, but I do just want to bring up this idea because it's so pernicious in conservation thinking and among people who care about conservation. This bias toward top-down solutions and this lack of faith in grassroots conservation practices and the kind of practices that existed before the conservation movement even got started, I think has led in part to conservationists and conservation-minded scientists being especially susceptible to ideas like the tragedy of the commons. And you may not have seen the paper I'm putting up here, but I'm sure you've heard the phrase, the tragedy of the commons. The phrase was made famous by Garrett Hardin, who was an ecologist. I think it's important to say he had his own very pretty extreme prejudices toward immigrants and people of color, which became clearer later in his life. You get a sense of it reading this paper, but later on it becomes a lot more explicit. This was an essay, not a piece of research, published in Science in 1968. And the core argument, and I apologize if you've heard all this before, but sometimes I feel like this is like the most important take-home lesson of my book. So I'll take a moment to go through it. It argues that unless shared resources are privatized or controlled by an external authority, this tragedy is inevitable. People will pursue their individual gain and use up whatever the shared resource is, whether it's water or forests or wildlife. And it's still taught. I mean, maybe you have encountered this. I know there are a few students listening. Maybe you've encountered this in school. Maybe it was taught to you critically, but in most cases, it's not. There was a study that came out in maybe 2019 showing that that in most cases, when it's taught in college sustainability programs, it's taught uncritically, as if, yes, this is true. This is a problem that the tragedy that the conservation movement has to deal with. So Eleanor Ostrom, who was starting her career at about the same time this essay was published, thought this was very strange. She was a young political scientist, and she happened to be studying a group of groundwater users in Los Angeles who had figured out a way to share their resource without resorting to, privatization or state intervention. And she was like, well, I know, it's not inevitable here because they figured it out. So there must be other places where it's not inevitable. And she wasn't saying it never happens. I mean, if you've been in a traffic jam, you've experienced the tragedy of the commons. If you've been in a dirty public toilet, you've experienced it. But Hardin was saying it always happens, unless the state gets involved or unless privatization happens. Ostrom was saying, no, there are cases where communities have figured this out for themselves. And she spent the rest of her career documenting this. And, documenting communities that had set up systems that had been in existence for, in some cases, for hundreds of years, for sharing pasture or sharing fisheries or forest resources, things like that. So her work was really important. She won the Nobel Prize before her death I think she won the Nobel Prize in 2009, shortly before her death in 2012. And for many reasons, one of which I'm sure is that she was a woman, she's not as well known as you'd think she would be, not even in her own field, and certainly not in conservation. I often hear people, professional conservationists, talk uncritically again about the tragedy of the commons. And I think it leads to a lot of, a strain of misanthropy in conservation that we don't have to be, that's really unwarranted. There are a lot of reasons for hope. So just briefly, Ostrom's work, combined with some grassroots activism in Southern Africa in the 80s by scholars, community leaders, and conservation activists, led to the community-led conservation movement. As part of my book research, I got to visit Namibia, which has a thriving nationwide system of community conservancies that really shift the burden, try to restore the relationship between people and wildlife that existed before colonization. It basically shifts the burdens and benefits of conservation so that people are able to recognize more, or be able to realize more of the benefits, and able to they're relieved of some of the burdens. And I can talk a little bit more about how this works if people are interested, but I found it, I'd heard about community-led conservation, found it really, seen it in practice in some small cases, but to see it happening on a nationwide level, and practiced by folks who had a lot of experience with it, had decades of experience with it, was really exciting and heartening for me. So I'll finish up by asking whether that model can help us here in the West, where we are so politically polarized, and where we still experience so many conflicts over vulnerable species, over the use of our land and water, and other shared resources. So, some of you may be involved with, I know there are many public lands partnerships and climate initiatives in the Gunnison Valley that involve, getting people of different perspectives together. And maybe some of you are involved with those and are nodding your head, oh, definitely, we need these kind of collaboratives. Maybe some of you have had bad experiences with them and are saying, no way, what a waste of time. And maybe other people are just looking at how polarized we are and saying, forget it, it's not worth it. I'll tell you a brief story that really gives me hope. This is the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Southern Oregon, famous as a stopover for migrating birds. And in 2016, it became famous for another reason. Ammon Bundy, who's a far-right activist, came to town and occupied, along with a few dozen of his friends, occupied the National Wildlife Refuge headquarters for more than 40 days. They brought, the world media to Southern Oregon. They drove the refuge staff out of their offices. They caused a great deal of damage inside and out. And they probably, their ideology is going back to the days of, this perceived land grab by the US government that drove, that disrupted from ranchers' perspective, locked up the forests from grazing. Those resentments have continued to fester, and people like Ammon Bundy think that national wildlife refuges and national forests and Bureau of Land Management land should be returned to the quote unquote original owners, white ranchers. and Southern Oregon is a pretty conservative area politically. It's very remote. I think these guys, in fact, they said as much, expected to be welcomed as liberators. But something really interesting happened instead. Local people really did not want these guys around. They saw them as interlopers. And the woman in the middle saying, thank you, Grasty. Judge Grasty was the county judge who was very outspoken against these insurrectionists, you might call them, or militia members. Support our county officials. There's a sign in the back that says, you are not my voice, go home militia. And these folks were joined by the leadership of the Burns Paiute tribe, in the area. This was the chairwoman of the tribe at the time, Charlotte Roderick, and she was awesome. She held a press conference a couple of days after this occupation began, and she said, "You want to talk about the original owners? You got another thing coming. I don't think any of you came over on the Bering Land Bridge. We were here first. We never ceded this land." And importantly, she also said, "We consider the Malheur Refuge to be good stewards of our cultural heritage in that area." So what Ammon Bundy and his buddies didn't realize is that there was a collaborative partnership that had started between the refuge and local ranchers back in 1998. So this is 2016. After many meetings, arguments, and so forth, they had come up with a plan to manage the refuge and the surrounding lands, on an ecosystem level. They had not only transformed land management, but they had then branched out into economic development. So they were really taking steps toward the transformation of society that Aldo Leopold talked about, restoring the local economy so that people could live more sustainably with their resources, managing land as an ecosystem rather than managing an island of habitat in a bunch of within a sort of sea of sacrifice zones. And so when the militia came in and said, "Oh, we're going to liberate you from the oppressive federal government," the local community was like, "Look, we have some problems with the federal government, but we have worked really hard to make this a workable relationship, and to increase our power in this relationship. Like, get out of here. You don't have any idea what you're talking about." So the happy ending to the story, and Ammon Bundy, he was just in the news today, causing a ruckus in Idaho. So that he's not gone, but he's gone from the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. The birds never left. And the partnership, if anything, has continued to thrive and grow. And I really love this quote from one of the co-founders of the partnership. They recognize that in order to be good stewards of the land, they really have to look at the landscape as a whole and then look at their part in it, their part as individuals and their part as landowners. And I think that idea has really taken hold in Harney County and the surrounding area. And what that says to me is that conservation really needs to be a fully functioning ecosystem. I was talking earlier about the conservation ecosystem. We need to restore those grassroots of the conservation ecosystem and make sure that it's functioning not just from the top down, but from the bottom up. And so that to me is the future of conservation, both locally and internationally. And I'd love to spend a few minutes talking about any questions you might have. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. That was so interesting. Folks, I just wanted to let you know that I am monitoring the chat box. So if you don't want to be seen or say it, I'll monitor it and I can speak for you. But if you do want to be seen and you do want to talk, I'll mute myself and questions go ahead.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Michelle. That was really fascinating.
Thanks.
I lived in Southern Oregon in 2016, and I remember that I was on the West Coast in Ashland, but I do remember hearing about that, but I didn't know it any great detail like you just described. So that really filled in that hole for me. I'm a student at Southern Oregon in the Masters of Environmental Management program, and my experience is not in public lands management.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I found this really fascinating. My focus is more in climate action at the municipal level.
Oh, great.
But I do think there's a lot of overlap.
A lot. Yeah.
With land management, conservation, and their carbon sequestration, all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to say thank you. And I found this really fascinating.
Thanks. I lost you a little bit there, but I agree. I agree. There's a ton of overlap at the local level, and there should be even more. I think, it's sometimes, we think about when I talk to activists, climate activists, sometimes they complain, oh, our field is so tech heavy. We're always talking about clean energy and especially at the local level, carbon sequestration and land conservation gets pushed a little to the side. But I think there's so many opportunities. And obviously, we have to be thinking about conservation too. We can't just think of environmentalism as climate action, as existentially crucial as that is. I wish we could only think about that because it's hard enough, but we got to think about conservation too.
No, absolutely. I'm writing the sustainability plan for the city of Gunnison, and we really don't touch on land. We talk about water and how there's a real big disconnect in the West between land use and water use. But we don't really get too much into conservation just because we had to narrow it down. But it's
of course.
This is making me think about how it needs to be incorporated more into our climate action plan.
Yeah, if there's ways to, talk about, carbon storage, and in grasslands as well as in forests, I think that there's a lot of connections to be made in people's minds as well as just practically. So you're in Gunnison now, not in Ashland.
I'm in Gunnison now. Yeah.
We're big Oregon Shakespeare Festival goers, so I know Ashland well.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Oh, thanks, Anita. So you must be a student of Laura Pritchett's.
Yes, indeed. And she speaks very highly of you. And I was,
I think very highly of her. She's wonderful.
She is. It was wonderful to hear you speak. I also, it's been now, we read your book in the summer. And so in the meantime, in an MFA program, we've read dozens more books. It was, I was trying to dredge up like what I could remember. And it was really nice to have this kind of reinforcement.
Good. Yeah.
Michelle,
is there a place in town to buy your book?
What's up?
Is there a place in town where we can buy your book? Do you know?
Apparently Abracadabra has a few copies.
Yeah, she ordered several copies, but I don't think it's going to come until end of March, Jenny, but I can definitely let you know. I know the owner.
Yeah.
But also, Michelle, I want to plug in for you too. If you visit her website, you can order it off her website too.
There's I can give you a link also to buy a signed copy at no extra charge. Let me find that. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Michelle, I have a question. I have a lot of questions for you because you just brought up so many relevant topics right in our field. I guess I'll do two if that's okay. The first question is when you had that kind of two levels of photos of various people and you were talking about them, who of that group would you love to meet? And like, why would you love to meet them, a living or dead?
My kid, when I made that slide, my kid was like, it's like a Zoom call with everyone in your book. And I was like, how fun would that be? Like just to get them all talking to each other. Because one of the most rewarding parts of the book, many of these people are well known. They've had biographies written about them. But so for me, as I said, one of the things I felt I could add was to, draw the story together. And one of the most fun things about the research was to find places where those folks had written to each other or talked about each other, talked shit about each other. Like they didn't always agree, but they were influenced by each other in ways that we don't often think about. So anyway, just to say that like, my ideal would be just to hear them being a fly on the wall when they all got together, which is of course impossible, but it would be really cool. I would love to hang out with Aldo Leopold, just because I feel like his thinking has been a guide for me for such a long time. And there's so many things I'd like to ask and hear about. And, a lot of people, including me, want to know what Aldo Leopold would think about the world today. He'd probably be horrified in many ways, but I think he would have really interesting observations of it. So, and I'd love to take a road trip with Rosalie Edge. She's so just like flamboyant and fearless and, totally unreasonable in really useful ways. I really enjoyed writing about her.
Yeah, that's really neat. I'm going to have to look up some of these people who I'm not as familiar with for sure. I guess another question that I have, and as you were talking about the happenings in Oregon, where, there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of tension with that resentment, with the folks that stormed that wilderness area or that wildlife area. From your learnings and who you've talked to, what's an appropriate method to handle resentment so that, these people not can come on our side, but can understand our side, maybe be more accepting of our side? And I'm not saying, that should be a goal for all of the world or all of the United States, but it's something that we as land managers or future to be land managers can experience. So I just want to get your expert thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question of our age in so many ways, isn't it? like how do we deal with this grievance and perceived grievance, real grievance and perceived grievance, grievance that we may feel ourselves? So many ways to answer that. I wrote a piece for Grist recently about just ways in which urban climate activists could work more effectively with rural climate activists or rural conservationists, because I've lived in small towns all my life, except when I was in college. And I really, even though I have one foot in the urban world because of my job, I feel like I kind of get small towns, and I do see how there's so many misconnections. Sometimes it's just because of vocabulary. And so I think we can learn a lot. And to be clear, like, some of that grievance and some of that misunderstanding is, to be sure, exaggerated and manipulated by right-wing media. Like there's a kernel of it that's warranted, I would say, but a lot of it is exaggerated. But I think we can there are ways in which conservationists can get around those knee-jerk grievances by avoiding, trigger words and, phrases that have become loaded with other meanings. Like, people really react to the word environmentalist in ways that they don't react to the word conservationist. I think a lot of us think, oh, those words are pretty much interchangeable, but to some listeners, they really are extremely different. So anyway, I wrote a piece for Grist about that in particular. And then I guess knowing history is really useful, because some of these grievances have long historical roots. And I'm talking about, grievances that I have a lot of sympathy for, like people whose land has been taken away by top-down conservation decisions, and then grievances I have some sympathy for, but somewhat less, overall somewhat less sympathy for it, where people who are resentful of government regulations. You still have your land, you still have your livelihood. It's being managed more sustainably. Come on, but I think that there's a story there that's really important to understand, and that it's a story that has a lot of truth to it. So, and I think, like I said, I think there is a real history of elitism and snobbery and discounting of local expertise that goes back to the very beginning of the conservation movement. So history is important, vocabulary is important. And then I would just say, your really interesting definition of extremism the other day, which was the inability to compromise, the total inability. Extremism is a total inability to compromise. And the rest of us are able to compromise without compromising our principles, like that we recognize the difference between bad compromise and good compromise. So I would look for ways in which you can make good compromises with people without, while finding the places where you agree. And I think there is, going back to vocabulary, I think there's much more ground for agreement than we often recognize, because we can't speak to each other about the things that we actually agree about. Anyway, many things to say about that, but I think that's a start.
Anita, did you have a question? Do you want me to read it, or do you want to say it?
I can go ahead and say it. You may have kind of answered it now along the way. It was just, what would you say is the most important shortcoming to be addressed in the conservation movement or circles today?
Yeah, I could go on, but I think, and I admire the conservation movement in many ways. I think, just speaking really broadly, I think it's that, excuse me, I think it's the integration of old and new, the recognition that old ancestral conservation practices have a lot to teach us, and that, even in places where those things have been long forgotten, we can learn from them. We can revive them in some cases, and that those can work within our existing institutions, so that we can have a conservation movement that operates at all scales, because I think it really needs to.
Sierra, are you in double shot?
I am. I was listening to the webinar while I was closing, so I really appreciate the information. It was the perfect
Thanks
time.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I recognize the background.
Yeah.
Sorry. I guess, sorry. If you have time, Michelle, I don't want to disrespect anyone's times, but I guess a couple of quick things before we sign off, because I want to, I'm going to share my screen again, hopefully. Here we go. As Michelle said, can you all see my screen okay? Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks, Jenny. I think that was Jenny. So I just want to give a plug again for Michelle's book. You can go to bookstores in town, and I know Abracadabra and I believe Townie Books in CB has it, or will have it, but you can also visit her website. And then, yeah, I just wanted to give another plug for you on that, Michelle. But then also, I've put a couple things in the chat box, as well as Michelle. One of those being our website, another one of those being our donation link. And then I also am going to put in a survey for you all to fill out if you'd be so willing. Just about this event. You can talk about Michelle if you want, and rave about her, because I'm sure going to, but then you can also provide feedback on like the technology side, etc. So please be willing to fill that out. And then, Michelle, I have one other question for you if you have time, but if you need to go, I totally understand. Okay.
No, go for it.
Okay. So sorry, I'm just checking my notes. During the conversation, you said, that there are economic impacts impacting, I'm assuming, I think you said tribal nations. Can you talk about, and from bison hunting, like that correlation and some of the economic impacts that they're experiencing today, if you've gotten to talk with tribal nations about this topic?
Yeah, that was a specific study that was done. I'm not going to be able to bring up the study right now, but there was a study done on, looking at whether you could see the kind of the fingerprints of the bison decline, 150 years later. And apparently you can, because some of these nations were among the richest in the world, in the 1800s, you know, if we can measure such a thing. And now, of course, they're among the poorest in the world. And the economic analysis pointed the finger at, in part, at the decline of bison, because it was just so integral to their economy and their culture, that the loss of this source of protein and warmth and all kinds of things, cultural stability, has had a, you know, a really an effect that reverberates through the generations. So, and it is really, I mean, I've spent some time with these restoration projects that are bringing bison back to tribal lands, and it is really moving how, you know, these animals are restoring the ecosystem too, but these are tribes that have lived. The bison were central to their culture, but they have lived without them on their lands for more than a century. But they still have this really strong cultural relationship with them because the stories have been remembered. And then to see these animals come back and people getting to live alongside these animals again, as they know that their, you know, great grandparents did, it's really cool. It's you can tell that it's really significant in ways that, you know, will reverberate, you know, much like the decline, the restoration will reverberate through generations in ways that we're just beginning to recognize. So that, I mean, to me, the bison is a example. You know, you're asking about the important shortcomings. I mean, I think the bison restoration is an example of what is really cool that's being done in conservation right now. Because I do think conservation, it's obviously moving too slowly, but it really is heading in the right direction. You know, it's becoming much more aware of the importance of these efforts that are supported at a local level as well as supported at a national and international level. So the bison, it has all those pieces. It has the cultural piece, it has the ecological piece, it has, you know, it is operating at small scales and large scales, and those scales are interconnected. So I think it's one of the most exciting things happening in conservation anywhere.
Thank you. I think we have a couple more minutes for any other questions.
Thanks for joining us tonight. Thanks for giving me a peek at Colorado.
All right. Well,
Thanks, Michelle.
yeah,
Thanks,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you for your time.
Take care, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much, Michelle. I really
Yeah,
appreciate
of
you.
course. Have a good night. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye.